Sheep, and the Lord is my shepherd, watching over my soul to keep guarding over me ever, watching wherever I go. And when the winds blow, He is my shelter. And when I'm lost and alone, He rescues me. And when the lion comes, He is my victory, constantly watching over me. He is constantly watching over me.
A Journey Through the Bible, Day 142 of 365, Sunday, May the 22nd, 2022. Today's reading, Psalm 127 and 128. 1 Kings chapter 6, verse 38, chapter 7, verses 1 through 12, and verses 15 through 22. 2 Chronicles chapter 3, verses 15 through chapter 17, and chapter 4, verse 1. 1 Kings chapter 7, verses 23 through 26. 2 Chronicles chapter 4, verses 2 through 5 and verse 10. 1 Chronicles chapter 7, verses 27 through 39. 2 Chronicles chapter 4, verse 6. 1 Kings chapter 6, verse 36. 2 Chronicles chapter 4, verse 9. 1 Kings chapter 7, verses 40 through 47. 2 Chronicles chapter 4, verses 11 through 18. 1 Kings chapter 7, verses 48 through 50. 2 Chronicles chapter 4, verse 7, 8, and 19 through 22. 1 Kings chapter 7, verse 51. And 2 Chronicles chapter 5, verse 1. Psalm 127 and 128 are brief statements of principles for the family. We would do well to read them often. Then we enter the 13th year period during which Solomon's palace was built. In 1 Kings chapter 7, verse 15, and 2 Chronicles chapter 3, verse 15, the writers begin a description of the furnishings of the temple.
Psalms 127, verses 1 through 5, a song of ascents of Solomon. Unless the Lord builds the house, those who build it labor in vain. Unless the Lord watches over the city, the watchman stays awake in vain. It is in vain that you rise up early and go late to rest, eating the bread of anxious toil, for He gives to His beloved sleep. Behold, children are a heritage from the Lord, the fruit of the womb a reward. Like arrows in the hand of a warrior are the children of one's youth. Blessed is the man who fills his quiver with them. He shall not be put to shame when he speaks with his enemies in the gate. Psalms 128, verses 1 through 6, a song of ascents. Blessed is everyone who fears the Lord, who walks in His ways. You shall eat the fruit of the labor of your hands. You shall be blessed, and it shall be well with you. Your wife will be like a fruitful vine within your house. Your children will be like olive shoots around your table. Behold, thus shall the man be blessed who fears the Lord. The Lord bless you from Zion. May you see the prosperity of Jerusalem all the days of your life. May you see your children's children. Peace be upon Israel. 1 Kings chapter 6, verse 38. And in the 11th year, in the month of Bul, which is the 8th month, the house was finished in all its parts, and according to all its specifications. He was 7 years in building. 1 Kings chapter 7, verses 1 through 7. Solomon was building his own house 13 years, and he finished his entire house. He built the house of the forest of Lebanon. Its length was 100 cubits, and its breadth 50 cubits, and its height 30 cubits. And it was built on 4 rows of cedar pillars, with cedar beams on the pillars. And it was covered with cedar above the chambers that were on the 45 pillars, 15 in each row. There were window frames in 3 rows, and window opposite window in 3 tiers. All the doorways and windows had square frames. And window was opposite window in 3 tiers. And he made the hall of pillars. Its length was 50 cubits, and its breadth 30 cubits. There was a porch in front with pillars, and a canopy in front of them. And he made the hall of the throne where he was to pronounce judgment, even the hall of judgment. It was finished with cedar from floor to rafters. 1 Kings chapter 7, verses 8 through 12. His own house where he was to dwell, and the other court back of the hall was of like workmanship. Solomon also made a house like this hall for Pharaoh's daughter, whom he had taken in marriage. All these were made of costly stones, cut according to measure, sawed with saws, back and front, even from the foundation to the coping, and from the outside to the great court. The foundation was of costly stones, huge stones, stones of 8 and 10 cubits, and above were costly stones, cut according to measurement, and cedar. The great court had 3 courses of cut stone all around, and a course of cedar beams. So had the inner court of the house of the Lord, and the vestibule of the house. 1 Kings chapter 7, verses 15 through 16. He cast 2 pillars of bronze. 18 cubits was the height of one pillar, and a line of 12 cubits measured its circumference. It was hollow, and its thickness was 4 fingers. The second pillar was the same. He also made 2 capitals of cast bronze to sit on the tops of the pillars. The height of the one capital was 5 cubits, and the height of the other capital was 5 cubits. 1 Kings chapter 7, verses 17 to 22. There were lattices of checkerwork with piece of chain work for the capitals on the top of the pillars. At lattice one capital and a lattice the other capital. Likewise, he made pomegranates in 2 rows around one lattice work to cover the capital that was on the top of the pillar. And he did the same with the other capital. Now the capitals that were on the tops of the pillars in the vestibule were of lily work, 4 cubits. The capitals were on the 2 pillars and also above the rounded projection, which was beside the lattice work. There were 200 pomegranates in 2 rows all around, and so with the other capital. He set up the pillars at the vestibule of the temple. He set up the pillar on the south and called its name Jacob. And he set up the pillar on the north and called its name Boaz. And on the tops of the pillars was lily work. Thus the work of the pillars was finished. 2 Chronicles 3, 15 through 17. In front of the house he made 2 pillars 35 cubits high, with a capital of 5 cubits on the top of each. He made chains like a necklace and put them on the tops of the pillars. He made 100 pomegranates and put them on the chains. He set up the pillars in front of the temple, one on the south, the other on the north. That on the south he called Jacob, and that on the north Boaz. 2 Chronicles chapter 4, verse 1. He made an altar of bronze, 20 cubits long and 20 cubits wide and 10 cubits high. 1 Kings chapter 7, verses 23 through 26. Then he made the sea of cast metal. It was round, 10 cubits from brim to brim, and 5 cubits high, and a line of 30 cubits measured its circumference. Under its brim were gourds for 10 cubits, compassing the sea all around. The gourds were in 2 rows, cast with it when it was cast. It stood on 12 oxen, 3 facing north, 3 facing west, 3 facing south, and 3 facing east. The sea was set on them, and all the rear parts were inward. Its thickness was a handbreadth, and its brim was made like the brim of a cup, like the flower of a lily. It held 2,000 baths. 2 Chronicles chapter 4, verses 2 through 5. Then he made the sea of cast metal. It was round, 10 cubits from brim to brim, and 5 cubits high, and a line of 30 cubits measured its circumference. Under it were figures of gourds for 10 cubits, compassing the sea all around. The gourds were in 2 rows, cast with it when it was cast. It stood on 12 oxen, 3 facing north, 3 facing west, 3 facing south, and 3 facing east. The sea was set on them, and all the rear parts were inward. Its thickness was a handbreadth, and its brim was made like the brim of a cup, like the flower of a lily. It held 3,000 baths. 2 Chronicles chapter 4, verse 10. And he set the sea at the southeast corner of the house. 1 Kings chapter 7, verses 27 through 30. He also made the 10 stands of bronze. Each stand was 4 cubits long, 4 cubits wide, and 3 cubits high. This was the construction of the stands. They had panels, and the panels were set in the frames. And on the panels that were set in the frames were lions, oxen, and cherubim. On the frames, both above and below the lions and oxen, there were wreaths of beveled work. Moreover, each stand had 4 bronze wheels and axles of bronze, and at the 4 corners were supports for a basin. The supports were cast with wreaths at the side of each. 1 Kings chapter 7, verses 31 through 39. Its opening was within a crown that projected upward 1 cubit. Its opening was round, as a pedestal is made, 1.5 cubits deep. At its opening there were carvings, and its panels were square, not round. And the 4 wheels were underneath the panels. The axles on the wheels were of one piece with the stands, and the height of a wheel was 1.5 cubits. The wheels were made like a chariot wheel. Their axles, their rims, their spokes, and their hubs were all cast. There were 4 supports at the 4 corners of each stand. The supports were of one piece with the stands, and on the top of the stand there was a round band 1/2 cubit high. And on the top of the stand its stays and its panels were of one piece with it. And on the surfaces of its stays and on the panels he carved cherubim, lions, and palm trees, according to the space of each, with wreaths all around. After this manner he made 10 stands. All of them were cast alike, of the same measure and the same form. And he made 10 basins of bronze. Each basin held 40 baths. Each basin measured 4 cubits, and there was a basin for each of the 10 stands. And he set the stands, 5 on the south side of the house, and 5 on the north side of the house. And he set the sea at the southeast corner of the house. 2 Chronicles chapter 4, verse 6. He also made 10 basins in which to wash, and set 5 on the south side and 5 on the north side. In these they were to rinse off what was used for the burnt offering, and the sea was for the priest to wash in. 1 Kings chapter 6, verse 36. He built the inner court with 3 courses of cut stone and 1 course of cedar beams. 2 Chronicles chapter 4, verse 9. He made the court of the priest and the great court and doors for the court, and overlaid their doors with bronze. 1 Kings chapter 7, verse 40 through 43. Hiram also made the pots, the shovels, and the basins. So Hiram finished all the work that he did for King Solomon on the house of the Lord. The 2 pillars, the 2 bowls of the capitals that were on the tops of the pillars, and the 2 lattice works to cover the 2 bowls of the capitals that were on the tops of the pillars, and the 400 pomegranates for the 2 lattice works, 2 rows of pomegranates for each lattice work, to cover the 2 bowls of the capitals that were on the pillars, the 10 stands and the 10 basins on the stands, and the 1 sea and the 12 oxen underneath the sea. 1 Kings chapter 7, verses 44 through 47. On the 1 sea and the 12 oxen underneath the sea, now the pots, the shovels, and the basins, all these vessels in the house of the Lord, which Hiram made for King Solomon, were of burnished bronze. In the plain of the Jordan the king cast them, in the clay ground between Succoth and Zarethan. And Solomon left all the vessels unweighed, because there were so many of them. The weight of the bronze was not ascertained. 2 Chronicles chapter 4, verses 11 through 18. Hiram also made the pots, the shovels, and the basins. So Hiram finished the work that he did for King Solomon on the house of God. The 2 pillars, the bowls, and the 2 capitals on top of the pillars, and the 2 lattice works to cover the 2 bowls of the capitals that were on the top of the pillars, and the 400 pomegranates for the 2 lattice works, 2 rows of pomegranates for each lattice work, to cover the 2 bowls of the capitals that were on the pillars. He made the stands also, and the basins on the stands, and the 1 sea, and the 12 oxen underneath it, the pots, the shovels, the forks, and all the equipment for these Hiram Abi made of burnished bronze for the King Solomon for the house of the Lord. In the plain of Jordan the king cast them, and the clay ground between Succoth and Zeradah. Solomon made all these in great quantities, for the weight of the bronze was not salt. 1 Kings chapter 7, verses 48 through 50. So Solomon made all the vessels that were in the house of the Lord, the gold altar, the golden table for the bread of the presence, the lampstands of pure gold, 5 on the south side and 5 on the north before the inner sanctuary, the flowers, the lamps, and the tongs of gold, the cups, snuffers, basins, dishes for incense, and 5 pans of pure gold, and the sockets of gold, for the doors of the innermost part of the house, the most holy place, and for the doors of the nave of the temple. 2 Chronicles chapter 4, verses 7 through 8. And he made 10 golden lampstands as prescribed, and set them in the temple, 5 on the south side and 5 on the north. He also made 10 tables and placed them in the temple, 5 on the south side and 5 on the north. He made 100 basins of gold. 1 Kings chapter 7, verse 51. Thus all the work that King Solomon did on the house of the Lord was finished. And Solomon brought in the things that David his father had dedicated, the silver, the gold, and the vessels, and stored them in the treasuries of the house of the Lord. 2 Chronicles chapter 5, verse 1. Thus all the work that Solomon did for the house of the Lord was finished. And Solomon brought in the things that David his father had dedicated, and stored the silver, the gold, and all the vessels in the treasuries of the house of God.
We are his children, and he is our Father, watching over our soul. Great is his love for his sons and his daughters.